Hello, hello, welcome back to Spellbound. I'm BJ the Book Witch, and this is my Black History Month wrap-up. So in February, I obviously tried to prioritize books by Black authors as much as I can, and this year I read so many books that I just cannot wait to talk about that I needed to make an entirely separate video about them. So let's get started. A Small Place by Jamaica Kincaid. This is a post-colonial portrait of the tiny island of Antigua in the West Indies, told with a beautiful, scathing prose. I rated this 5 stars easily and read it twice in one sitting. It's 81 pages. I really can't describe this book better than the author can, so I'm going to just read what's on the back of the book. Lyrical, sardonic, and forthright, A Small Place magnifies our vision of one small place with Swiftian wit and precision. Jamaica Kincaid's expansive essay candidly appraises the 10 by 12 mile island in the British West Indies where she grew up and makes palpable the impact of European colonization and tourism. The book is a missive to the traveler, whether American or European, who wants to escape the banality and corruption of some large place. Kincaid, eloquent and resolute, reminds us that the Antiguan people, formerly British subjects, are unable to escape the same drawbacks of their own tiny realm, that behind the benevolent Caribbean scenery are human lives, always complex and often fraught with injustice. So, like I said, it is very short. At only 81 pages, it can easily be read in a single sitting, and I highly recommend reading it. And then I recommend reading it again. Conjure Women by Afia Atakora. This is a story about a mother and daughter, healers in their community, and it spans 2 timelines. So, before the Civil War, when the mother and daughter were enslaved on a plantation, and after, when the daughter is grown, and is the healer for her now freed community but still living on the plantation. The MacGuffin of this story is the relationship that both women and both timelines have to the master's white daughter, Verena. This is a sweeping plot full of magical realism and really brings to light the role and power that spirituality and superstition can have over a group or community of people. So much of magical realism is experiencing it in the moment when you're reading it, and so I don't want to go into any more detail really about the ways that this book becomes unique, the ways that this book becomes powerful, and what it's really saying, because I don't want to spoil those aspects that are both jarring to read, difficult to read, and also magical to read. The first half of it I listened to an audiobook and it was good, but typically for magical realism I prefer to read it, but the audiobook was narrated really well, so either one might be a good choice. And I rated it 5 stars. I hope that was clear. 5 stars. Excellent book. Flowers for the Sea by Zin E. Rocklyn. This is a gothic speculative horror about survivors from a flood surviving on an ark, and the main character is pregnant with a monster. I can't and won't say more than that, but it is dark, it is gritty, and it is gripping. I rated it 4.5 stars, and I highly, highly recommend it. Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Dr. Beverly Tatum. This is a nonfiction book that describes the way that race and racism shows up psychologically in children in early development years, elementary, adolescence, and then into adulthood. Contrasted between bi-POC individuals and families and their relationship to race and racism, and white individuals and families and their relationship and even awareness of race and racism. So basically it shows how our identities are formed and then solidified and when we're raised in a systemically racist environment, and at what point that chasm between races starts to form and develop, and how those on one side of the chasm are very aware of the chasm, and those on the other side don't actually become aware of it until adulthood, and then they're surprised and befuddled by it. So this is a 5-star book. It's a really dense and interesting read. Dense not in boring, but dense in that it is full of data and really interesting material. So a third of the book, first of all, is a reintroduction to the book and an update since its original publication date from the 90s. How sad is that? That literally nothing has changed. And in fact, some things have gotten worse and in recent years gone in a backwards direction, but the republication date was in 2016, but it was originally published in the late 90s. So like a third of it is addressing what has changed and what has stayed the same in this book, which I thought just made the book even more relevant. Also, it does talk about what has been changed throughout the book from its original publication date, and drew attention to different sets of terminology, different phrasing, and the addition of some specific chapters that had additional levels of representation and potential and intersectionality. It also had over 100 pages of chapter-specific notes, cites, and source material. So what made this book really interesting is that it was incredibly data driven. Like, this is not an opinion piece of any kind. It is based on decades of data, psychological data, to really show how and when the awareness of racism comes about in different identity groups. So it was really, really interesting. But for that, it was not hard to read. Like, it's not in layman's terms. So that's why I just really resonated with this book in particular. I've read several different books, and in fact, I'm making a separate video in a couple of days about all the different types of nonfiction books that have helped me decolonize and the different lenses that they took to get here. But this one was a really good, I don't want to say middle of the road, but just a good balance between everything in here is data driven, and it has all the sites to back it up, across decades and decades of studies. But it's also easy to read and follow along, and you don't have to be a social scientist to understand what she's talking about in this book. So 5 stars, and I highly recommend it. Like everything else on this list, 5 stars, and I highly recommend it. A Song Below Water by Bethany C. Morrow. This is a YA fantasy about a Black teenager who is a siren in a world where it is like almost illegal to be a siren, but they are definitely the most feared and the most hated of all of the mythological beings that you can be, and that is because only Black women can be sirens. So in this world, it is illegal to use your siren call or your siren voice, and if you are found doing so in any capacity, you are forced to wear a silencing collar. So it is not hard to see that this book is quite obviously a very present and poignant allegory for the lived experience and intersectionality of Black women in existence. But this book, this plot, is about this Black teenager who is a siren and her sister who is something else, as they together discover the power of identity, like self-expression, sisterhood, action, and voice. So not only is it a fantastical and masterful allegory for the lived experience of Black women, it is also, and at the same time, a very delightful read. It is fantastical and sometimes even whimsical in the way that it portrays these very unique types of mythological beings. And like, this is so beyond your typical fairies and mermaids European-centric lore, and this really pulls from some unique ways of including mythological beings, and it was so much fun to read. And it held both. It didn't take turns being important and necessary and then being silly and whimsical. They were both throughout the entire reading experience. It was so much fun to read, and it was so heavy and hard and light and lighthearted at the same time. I cannot stop talking about this book. It was so good. I bought the sequel before I was even finished with the first book. It's an instant favorite, an instant favorite, and it is all of these things in the backdrop of like a contemporary YA. Like, this isn't a high fantasy. This is just real life, and so it was so tangible. It was so relatable. It was so tangible. It was so good. It was so good. And it's one that's going to stay with you, and it's one that you're also going to want to read again. I already want to read it again, but I'm going to read the sequel first. So 5 stars. Highly enjoyed it, and I highly recommend it. And finally, OPHIE'S Ghosts by Justina Ireland. This is a middle grade gothic novel about young Ophi and her mother who are forced to flee their Georgia hometown of the Jim Crow South in the middle of the night. And on the night that they escape, Ophi discovers that she can see ghosts. So when they move north to Pittsburgh to live with some distant relatives, Ophi and her mom start working as housekeepers for Daffodil Manor for this wealthy white family. And it is there that Ophi realizes that this house is super fucking haunted, and it's full of all these ghosts and spirits that can't seem to move on. And throughout the book, Ophi realizes what it means for something or someone to truly be haunted. And of course, this was another 5-star book. This book was so good. It was so well done. It is a gothic middle grade, and it is both entirely true to the gothic aesthetic and entirely true to the plot development and structures that are familiar to us in middle grade. It was so well done. So first of all, Ophi was such a likable protagonist, and she was struck a perfect balance between maintaining her plucky and curious nature without operating outside the confines of what would have been realistic behavior in context for her character in the 1920s. So it felt really authentic because because it also helped her charm come through on every page, because how her spirit was never dimmed because of these incredibly oppressive circumstances. And especially when she's going through such an incredibly fable. Especially when she's going through such a huge life change, right? So she's going from a childish, carefree, barefoot existence in the extremely violent Jim Crow South, and then having a whole culture shock of going and working for Daffodil Manor and this sort of forced maturity that she's supposed to take on in the North. And through all of this, she never loses her spark. But aside from Ophi, the story was so compelling. Like, it's so compelling. And the way that this author could have you smiling and chuckling at something plucky and charming that this protagonist, little Ophi, has just said, and then in the very next sentence, throwing in a detail that is so disturbingly graphic and violent and is so flippant in its delivery that it slams you back into the time period. Like, you feel like a roller coaster that has just stopped, and you're like, oh, right, this is where we are. And it is the author telling you, like, hey, don't forget, just because this is a ghost story does not mean that this is a fantasy. This book was so good. It was an instant middle grade favorite of mine, but also, like, immediately went into what is like a collection of highly recommended middle grades that I have, because it hits all the marks and transcends them at the same time. It's an incredible story, an incredible setting, and very compelling characters, and perfect for the age group. So I highly, highly recommend it. It was a 5-star read. So those were some of the Black History Month books that I was able to get my hands on in February and was able to read. But I would really love to hear from you. What books have you read in February? What books by Black authors have you been reading recently? And have you read any of the ones that I talked about in this video? Let me know down below. And then if you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you loved it, hit subscribe. And of course, there's always Instagram. So take care. And as always, happy reading.